Hi everybody, welcome back to another Steam Deck video, and in this guide tutorial I'm going to be talking about how you can get better frames per second, smoother gameplay out of a game that doesn't have built-in FSR, but rather what we're going to be doing is using the Steam Deck's OS level FSR to improve performance. Now, FSR, you're probably thinking, what's FSR, Rob? Well, FSR is Fidelity FX Super Rendering or Super Resolution by AMD. And it's a way that games can perform better than they would if they didn't have it installed. It's a similar thing you may well have heard of NVIDIA's DLSS, which is Deep Learning Super Sampling. The problem with NVIDIA's solution is that it's hardware specific. So if you want to use DLSS, you need to have a device that has an NVIDIA chip or an NVIDIA card into it, and we know the Steam Deck doesn't have that, so we use AMD's solution as well. And the beauty with the AMD solution is it will work on an NVIDIA chip, it will work on an AMD chip, it will kind of work on anything. However, certain games, older games in particular, in this example, The Division, don't have it built in because it wasn't around when the devs made the game. So we can't apply it to get the advantage that FSR brings. But the Steam Deck with the SteamOS has it built in, so we can. Now, in the description below this video, you'll see me doing a similar thing, but with Cyberpunk 2077, which has FSR built in. So if you're trying to do this with a game that has FSR built in and want to know kind of, well, what does it mean and how does it work, look at my Cyberpunk video. If it's a different game that doesn't have FSR, whether it be The Division or something else, then this might be for you. So let's go into The Division and let's kind of have a look. Now remember, with this thing, I mean, I've got the performance overlay on here, and you can see the frames per second down in the bottom left-hand corner there. We're currently running at about 46 frames a second. Often when you install a game on your Steam Deck with the default settings, it will run very nicely indeed. And the easiest way often to get a game running, better is often just to go into the settings. And in this case with the Division, you can go into and you can auto detect settings. And what that will do with the Division 1 is it will probably set everything to low. And you might think, oh, that's no good. I want better looking graphics than that. But to be honest, it looks amazing on low and runs really good. It gets up to sort of almost 90 frames a second most of the time. So what I've done, for the sake of this video and this kind of tutorial guide, I've whacked up the graphics quality to high so you get an idea of what's happening. So this means that what we're getting, as you can see, is about 46, 45 frames per second. We're here in snowy New York. I mean, it looks absolutely fantastic, doesn't it? It looks really, really good. And for me, anything over 30 frames a second is brilliant. And do we need any more? But I'm going to show you how to do that. So what FSR does, similarly to other programs as well, such as DLSS, is it is an algorithm that upscales images. So what it basically can do is that if the game was to render The Division in this case, not at 800p, because the Steam Deck screen is 1280 by 800, so let's call that 800p. If the game was to instead run it at, say, 720p, so a smaller bit, and then the FSR was to step in and go, I'll take each one of those frames and using my special super algorithm, I'll make them to the proper size very, very quickly, faster than the built-in processor could actually render a fresh image, then you get that performance boost. So it's very clever the way it works. The catches are that sometimes this can introduce latency into a game because it's got to take time to do this. And that means that although the game is running at a faster frame rate, it will be running slightly behind your controls. Now, I haven't really noticed this, and it's probably really only in first-person shooters that you would. And then also you will get a degradation in image quality, often with artifacting around the edges of things, and sometimes you'll see ghosting. However, you can edit the sharpness, as I'll show you in a minute, to change that, to get it to how you want the game to look. Because, I mean, for example, myself, I wear glasses when I'm playing on my Steam Deck or my computer, so my eyesight isn't the best. So will I notice something that is, slightly better or slightly worse? Often I won't. My eyes just don't resolve that level of detail, so I don't need to go into that. So, as you can see, we're currently getting about 54 48 frames per second. So we could just go into the settings and turn things down to low, but we're not going to. What we're going to do is we're going to use the in-game DLSS. Now, first off, I just want to check a few things. So we're going to go into the performance menu, and we're going to make sure we're using the per game profile. I've turned off the frame limit as well, so it will zip along as fast as it likes. And I've made sure we haven't got a TDP or a power limit on as well to restrict things. And we've got the scaling filter set to FSR, and we've got the FSR sharpness to 3, like that. And the scaling mode I've put to auto. I just changed that, didn't I? There we go. I pressed it. There we go. So that's kind of all set up to go. So now what we do is we now go into the settings of the game. Here we are. And we need to go into the video settings. Now we need to make sure that the game is in Windows mode, or windowed mode, sorry. Not windowed full screen, but just windowed. We don't want it to be on full screen mode. And then we go down and we change the resolution down. In this case, the lowest we can get to is 720p. You might, the lower value that this can go down, normally the bigger the performance increase you will get at the expense of the image quality. So what you should see is, if you look in the bottom left hand corner of the screen there, you might be able to see it says FSR off. What's going to happen, and look at, and we were about 40 frames a second, weren't we? So if I press X to apply these settings, FSR has jumped to on, and we can say OK, and we can come out of it. And what we now get is we're getting slightly better frames per second. So now it's going up to 48, 45. We almost went over to 50 there, didn't we? So it depends what's going on the screen at the time. So what FSR is doing is it's scaling that 720p image up to an 800p image. And you might have noticed that the character looks slightly more, well, actually it looks pretty good. If you look at the writing in the bottom left-hand corner, what we get in there is this slight artifacting around the writing. Now, normally what happens is, where a game has FSR built in, it applies the FSR upscaling or the DLSS upscaling before it adds the HUD on. Because anything that's got a hard edge, you'll know this if you muck around with JPEGs in photography and changing file sizes and things like that. Anything that hard edge normally then starts to generate artifacts. But if we're using a OS level FSR solution, then that's not going to happen. So there we go. So we're running around. So we kind of get in, what we get, about 40 frames per second. So let's go back into here. Let's go back into the settings. Let's go back into the video. Let's put this back up to 1280 by 80. So when we apply this, FSR is going to turn off. We say OK. Go back. Come out of that. And we get in less than 40 frames a second now, aren't we? Let's go to 42, 40, 38. So depending on the game, you're going to get different results. And to be honest, in this particular case, with the Division, see, we're under 40 now, aren't we? 36, 35, 32. So you can see the advantage we had with FSR on, and then the slightly lower frames with FSR off. Often this may well work better in situations where you're dipping in a game, you're dipping below, say, 30 frames a second, and you're getting into that, I don't like playing a game at 24 frames per second or 20 games a second, where FSR will get it up to 30 frames a second and work that way. Because as I've kind of said, the Steam Deck screen is very, very good at giving you a smooth experience and getting rid of things like screen tearing. So kind of just to cover the basics again, just because it's easy to kind of forget them. In order to get FSR working, you need to make sure that your scaling filter is set to FSR here. And your FSR sharpness, you can play around with that, depending on how you want the game to look, whether you want it to be sharper, softer or sharper. And then you need to make sure that in your game, you go into the settings and you go into, say, often it'll be the video settings. Make sure it's in window mode. And then you change it so that you're reducing the resolution. And what you should see is when you apply those settings, FSR jumps to on. Obviously, you don't have to have the overlay to make sure it's on, but it's just a way of checking it. And then you'll get that that bump in slight bump in frame rate, whether that be a few percentage points or more, really depending on the game and how it responds to that. Now, before we go, I just want to mention one other thing, and that is it can become quite a rabbit hole to chase frames per second and change lots of settings and kind of become a bit obsessed by it. And instead of enjoying the game, we start to really spend too much time doing this sort of thing. And one of the things that people forget is that smooth gameplay isn't always about maximum frames per second. It can also be to do with consistency of frame rate as well. So sometimes you may well find, depending on the game, if we were to go into the settings, let's go down to the video again. So let's change that up to 1280 by 800. Let's change that to full screen. Let's apply that. So FSR is going to turn on. Let's go back to the graphics. Let's turn the graphics down to medium. VSync there, shadow quality, contact shadows. What we're interested in here is motion blur. I'm not sure if, it could be that this division doesn't have motion blur, but often motion blur is a very, very good way, especially on the Steam Deck screen with single player games, of making lower frame rates look very good. Cyberpunk 2077 has this. So what we could do is we could also go into our settings on our game, and we could go into the frame limit, and we could turn the frame rate down to, say, so to catch up, 30 frames per second. There we go. And we can make sure in the settings on the game we have got VSync is on. And then let's turn off the overlay. In fact, we can leave the simple one on. And now, although we've only got 30 frames a second, we're going to be getting a consistent 30 frames a second. And I find quite a lot of the time, this makes a game look just as good. If there's a little bit of motion blur, all the better. And then what happens now is that you don't get the frames jumping up and down. Now, a lot of people may be watching this and saying, oh, no, I can't, I don't want to be playing games on my super duper Steam Deck at 30 frames a second. But I think the Steam Deck and the Steam Deck OS is much better, and the low frame rate games running at 30 frames a second look way better than they would on the equivalent television or the equivalent monitor. I don't know what it does, but it's doing something to make them look, I think, look a lot smoother. Maybe it's just the sheer quality of the screen. And I would be more than happy to do this. And this also means you can then run at high resolutions. And you can get, in games that, I don't know how many PC games do this, but on console, games would run with variable resolution. So the idea is you would have 1080p around the middle, and then you'd have 600p around the outside. But the more time a game has to render, the better the image is going to look. And also, you're going to save battery life, aren't you, if you're going on a long trip. And I think this looks absolutely fine. I mean, it might look slightly juddery as we spin around, but it doesn't look half as juddery as it would on a computer monitor. And obviously on YouTube, where you're watching this, the video is only being recorded at 30 frames a second, so it's debatable about how you're going to be able to see this, and you may well be getting a different impression. But to me, actually playing on the deck, it looks fine. It looks definitely playable, and very, very nice indeed. So there we go. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you have, hit like. If you want to see more of the same, press subscribe, and I will of course see you again soon.